So it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Boersma from the University of Amsterdam. And he's one of the more computationally oriented optimality theorists out there. When I say computationally oriented, I mean in two respects. Oh wait, there's our introducer. All right. He went away again.
You went away again?
Yeah, he saw he was off the hook, so he left. When I say computationally oriented, I mean two aspects. One is in the just in the sense that he's interested in the formal underpinnings of the theory which lead to computational problems, and the other is that unlike most people who have worked in the area, he's actually done implementation. So some of you have worked in OT may have used the prop program, which is capable of doing generation and learning, and I don't even know what else at this point, but it seems to keep adding features. One of the things that Paul's best known for is what's called the gradual learning algorithm, which is a way of learning the ranking of constraints in optimality theory using something which is akin to simulated annealing. So here is a rethinking of the architecture of OT called listener-oriented phonology. It's my pleasure to sit down and listen to it, and I think it'll be yours here.
Thank you. Is this the right sound? I can't hear myself through the loudspeakers. Okay, I'll start with the big picture. So what's listener-oriented phonology? Well, 99% of all phonologists take the speaker-based viewpoint. This picture, which is not on your handout, but you might draw it there, makes the comparison explicit. In the speaker-based view, you start by modeling a speaker. So a speaker has an underlying form, some concatenation of lexical items, for instance, turns that by his or her grammar into a surface form, so a hidden abstract surface structure, and then maybe a module called phonetic implementation or something like that turns that into an overt form, a phonetically detailed form. Now the task of the listener in such a speaker-based model would be to undo that mapping. So given an overt form, an auditory form, auditory representation, the listener would have to choose from among multiple candidates an underlying form that gives rise in the speaker's grammar to that same overt form. Right? So that's the task of the listener, and that model is rather intricate. Now here's the reverse model that I argue for in this talk. The listener is straightforward. The listener takes an overt form, computes surface structure from that, and from that accesses the lexicon. So this two-step model is something that many psycholinguists have proposed. First step could be called perception, could also be called robust interpretive parsing in Tessa and Smolensky's formulation, and the second step could be called recognition, and other psycholinguists call this the pre-lexical stage, and this is the lexical stage, right? So there are many different kinds of terminology to talk about this, but they all mean the same thing, I think. The task of the speaker in this model is very different from what the speaker does here. Given an underlying form, the speaker doesn't choose a surface form directly, but she chooses an overt form that is a pronunciation. And from all candidate pronunciations, she computes the hidden surface structure that she thinks the listener will construct from it. And she will take into account the results of her view of the listener's perception. So I'll talk about this and find evidence in real language data that shows that in many cases this is more correct than this model. You can see that there's one representation less in this model than there, and that's because the The speaker takes into account the extent to which the listener can reconstruct a message, but only the phonological message without lexical access. So it's certainly the most economical standpoint not to include the underlying form here. Now, this is the big picture. You can find more of that in my work from '98 on. And I will give one single example during this talk, and that's the case of H aspiré in French. So I'll talk about that example only. First start with the data then. In French, words can start in 3 different ways. Words can start with a consonant. That's the masculine word garçon, the feminine word femme. These pipes here depict the underlying form. These are underlying forms. They're stored in this way in the lexicon, right? Then there are words that we call H aspiré words, literally meaning aspirated H. H aspiré words are like this. Hasard, meaning coincidence or peril. And the feminine word os, meaning rise. And there are now words that start with vowels, like or the feminine word idée. Right? And the talk is about these words here. H aspiré words sometimes act like as if they start with a consonant, sometimes they act as if they start with a vowel, and sometimes they act like neither. And the neither case makes the big difference between the speaker-based and the listener-oriented views. So, the little sign here, no one wonders what it is. That's the IPA symbol for a glottal stop. It's an arbitrary symbol that I'll use here to mark the H aspiré. Utterance initially, or phrase initially, H aspiré acts like a vowel. So you say hasard, os, idée, and it's complete neutralization. So it acts like a vowel, or perhaps a vowel acts like H aspiré, who can tell? But there are 4 processes in French where H aspiré acts differently from a vowel, and I'll present all of those 4 processes to you now. The first process is elision. Say your underlying form has the definite article le, followed by a masculine noun. It works like this on the 6 examples that I showed you, right? Only those 6 examples will occur during this talk. So garçon, le garçon. Hasard, you say le hasard. Homme, you don't say le homme, you say l'homme. That's the elision case, right? So the schwa, the underlying schwa here, is elided. Only if the word starts with a vowel. Feminine words, la plus a feminine noun, you say la femme, la os, l'idée. So elision of a only in vowel initial words, not in consonant initial words, and not in H aspiré initial words. So elision of schwa or a only for vowel initial words. Apparently H aspiré blocks this elision like a consonant does, so it acts like a consonant in this case. And indeed, that's the way how people have viewed it. So these are the 3 words, the 3 cases for le garçon, le hasard, le homme. The first phonological process is elision. Elision only applies if the schwa is adjacent to the vowel, so it applies in l'homme. It doesn't apply in le hasard because at this stage of the derivation, this H aspiré is still a consonant. It's a glottal stop and that's a consonant, right? And at the next stage in the derivation, you remove the glottal stop and you get le hasard. So you get le garçon, le hasard, and l'homme. Right? This is how people used to do it in the ages of derivational phonology. So H aspiré blocks elision because it is still a constant when elision applies in the derivation. The rule ordering here is counterfeeding for people who are working in opacity. So if we want to model this in OT, as we will later on, we can expect some problems. This is the first case, elision. Now, I have shown the underlying form of H aspiré as a glottal stop. Well, people have done many things about this. H aspiré is a constant. Many people have said it's a consonant. François Del said it's an abstract constant. Larry Hyman, that it's a floating feature plus continental. Jean-François Prunet proposed that it has no features at all. And the people who I will refer to most, Meisenburg and Gabriel, simply represented underlyingly as a glottal stop and a tilde below it, and the tilde means Greek. So there are many realizations which it is produced as Greeky voiced. So le hasard, right? You Greek the A. Other people have proposed syllable structure analysis of it. So Clemens and Kaiser, for instance, have proposed that H aspiré has an empty onset and vowel initial words have no onset. And de Jong has proposed the exact reverse. So no onset for H aspiré initial words and empty onset for vowel initial words. So someone has said, I believe, I don't know who it was, that if you get the representations right, you get the phonology right. This clearly belies that, right? You have opposite representations and the same surface, so you have the opposite phonology as well. Yeah, that was quite funny at the time. So other people have proposed things like a syllable island. So hasard, this little dot here means a syllable boundary. So hasard comes with a prepended syllable boundary and doesn't, and so on. I'll follow this symbol here because nothing much hinges on it. Okay, second process. Enchaînement or enchainment. This happens with vowel initial words. The word quel, meaning which, followed by a masculine noun, masculine noun, right. Quel garçon, quel hasard, quel homme. Now in the case of quel homme, you see this so-called enchainment. The L of quel becomes the onset of the second syllable, quel homme. But the quel hasard, this is the case in which you actually do hear either a pause or a glottal stop or creak or any combination of these, right? Some auditory cues for the syllable boundary or the glottal stop, or whichever way you want to represent it. The H aspiré. So a triple contrast here between quel hasard and quel homme. And that notation is from them. So enchainment only works for vowel initial words again, and H aspiré seems to block it. Indeed, it again works as if it's a consonant. And the derivation would be that quel plus hasard becomes quel syllable boundary hasard, whereas quel homme via enchainment becomes que syllable boundary l'homme. And then you delete the glottal stop and you're simply left with a syllable boundary here and there. Well, we already see that the thing is actually pronounced here, right? So this is already a little bit of a problem for this abstract analysis, which follows Tranel and others. So the question is already, what is a surface representation? Is a surface representation something like this, very phonetic representation, quel hasard, including the phonetic detail, versus quel homme, Well, that's what Chomsky and Halley would have said in 1968. If it's phonologically relevant, then the detail has to be included. Some other people, this is the nonlinear phonology style, they wouldn't care about phonetic detail and simply only mention the syllable boundary. And in OT nowadays, you see some combination of those. People don't really know anymore what a surface structure is. There's no principled way to write a surface structure in OT. It can contain hidden material like syllable boundaries and phonetic material. But three-level theories of phonology have a very specific answer to that question. So Tessa and Smolensky's model and my own model make a distinction between a phonetic representation or an overt form, if you can equate them, and a hidden syllable structure. The third process is called liaison, linking. Some consonants, and I'll write them diacritically with an underlining, such as les, the plural of the article, work like this. You say les garçons, so you don't pronounce the Z, you don't say les garçons. You say les hasards, you don't say les hasards. You say les hommes. Same with the feminine words, les femmes, les hausses, so the rises, and les idées, the ideas. So the liaison, the linking of this consonant, only occurs for vowel initial words. Les hommes, les idées. And aspiré words, again, block liaison. It's like a consonant does. The Z is not pronounced. So this is the third time that aspiré works as if it's a consonant. And the derivation would, of course, be that liaison only takes place if the Z is adjacent to a vowel, so that this underlying structure can turn into les hommes. It doesn't work here because at this point of the derivation there is still a consonant here, so the Z drops, les hasards. And at the very end of the derivation the glottal stop is deleted. And you get this contrast here, les hasards versus les hommes, one with liaison and one without. That's the third one. Well, this is the way people, many people have been thinking about this. You get a headache of reading all that. So this is only a very, very, very small fraction. So I provisionally settled for a diacritic, which is what most people do. You have to take it up and you have to tell the lexicon, or the lexicon has to tell us whether a thing is a liaison consonant or is a fixed consonant, as in quel. So quel always has the L pronounced and les rarely has the Z pronounced. And the fourth process is schwa drop. This will be different from the other ones, as we can see here. So we have underlying une. It's usually pronounced une, you say une femme. So the schwa is deleted before a consonant. We also say une idée. So the schwa is deleted before a vowel as well. But you say une hausse. Une hausse. So before aspiré, the schwa is not deleted. So this is the case where aspiré works like neither a consonant, neither a vowel. Unlike a consonant in this case. So why? Well, if you want to derive it in the same way as the first three cases, then, okay, you have to elide a schwa, or to delete a schwa before a consonant, you get une femme. You have to enchain the N to the E, and deleting the schwa, so to get une idée. But of course then with une hausse, you would have to delete the schwa as well, because you still have a consonant there. And with deletion of the glottal stop, you would get this structure, probably pronounced une hausse, like quel hasard with some creak, something like that. This is what you would get if H aspiré acted like a consonant. But you don't get it. You predict une hausse analogously to quel hasard, and while that form actually does occur in a minority of cases, the form une hausse is usual, and Tronel actually mentioned this as the only form. So it has to be explained. Something like that, pronouncing schwa is impossible with quel hasard or quel héros. So this form is different, and I hope to have shown now that this speaker-based account generates the wrong form for une hausse. But this is derivation of phonology. So we'll see about OT in a minute. So why is une hausse so special, right? Well, Tronel says about this, the schwa, the surfacing of schwa in une hausse is a possible strategy for resolving the conflict caused on the one hand by the phonological pressure exerted by forward syllabification VCV sequences, and on the other hand by the syllable island constraint characteristic of H aspiré words. What does this mean? It means that if you have U, N, O, you pronounce it as une hausse. So the forward syllabification, that's the enchainment case. So une hausse is out, right? The hausse has to be a syllable island. Okay, but that would still predict une hausse, not une hausse. So Tronel doesn't give the explanation for schwa. This explanation would also apply to this form here, to this pronunciation. So a speaker-based non-answer to the question, what's so special about une hausse, is that H aspiré acts like a consonant. You get le hasard versus l'homme, quel hasard versus quel homme, les hasards versus les hommes, une hausse versus une idée, except that you don't get une hausse. So only 3 of the 4 processes are handled correctly in this model, and the 4th isn't. Now, okay, moving something. Now we'll give the listener-oriented answer. So first tell you what's going on, and then formalize it. So the answer is, well, you want to maintain an auditory difference between vowel initial and aspiré initial words. And how is this achieved? Well, in the hasard versus homme case, in the le case, it's achieved very well. You say le hasard versus l'homme. So there's a very good difference between the two. This one has the schwa, and this one hasn't. So it's a good difference, right? A vowel constitutes a difference between the two, right? In quel hasard versus quel homme, the difference is okay-ish, right? This could be a pause or a creaky pause or some glottal stop. It's not a real segment, but okay, it is a contrast. It's the best you can do. Then the case of les hasards versus les hommes, the liaison case, that's a good contrast as well, because in les hommes you have the Z surfaces, and in les hasards it doesn't surface. Real good contrast. The whole consonant is the difference. Now, the 4th case, okay, you couldn't say une hausse, because that would fall together with une idée. That would be a very bad contrast, because there's no difference at all. But the thing predicted by the speaker-based account, une hausse versus une idée, that would give the same okay-ish contrast, the creaky pause. Well, this contrast here, une hausse versus une idée, has an even better contrast. Schwa versus no schwa. So it's as good as le hasard versus l'homme. It's a very good contrast. Why isn't that available in the case of quel hasard? Well, it doesn't have an underlying schwa, and you're sort of forbidden to pronounce non-underlying schwas. Right? So in a listener oriented account, we can already understand what's going on. Preferably you pronounce schwa, because that makes a good difference between, you know, a form here and a form there. If that's not available, you have a second choice. So either a schwa or a consonant, and if that's not possible, something glottal. Well, what explaining it in these functional terms is something different from convincing phonologists who want to, you know, only a formal explanation. So I'll try to formalize it within the framework of optimality theory, for instance, Smolensky, 93. And I'll show you two possible formalizations. First, speaker-based OT, and listener-oriented OT. Well, if I want to do speaker-based OT, I will have to propose constraints for French. I'll mention some of them. First, structural constraints, constraints on surface forms. Well, certain initial consonant clusters are forbidden in French. I can abbreviate that as star. This means initial something, in this case a phrase. And then two consonants. Certain type of consonant clusters are out. You can't say le garçon, le hasard. Those are out. So this constraint is never violated. No actually occurring phrase in French violates this constraint, because these two things are impossible. Then there's a constraint, also never violated, that says that the liaison consonant is never followed by another consonant. You don't say les garçons, les hasards, but you can say les hommes because it's followed by a vowel. That constraint is never violated at all. This is not a very good formulation. If you think that, then I agree with you, but this is not the topic of this talk. So I'll just name it like that. And then the main point, speaker-based faithfulness, as proposed by McCarthy and Prince, 95. That's faithfulness for a two-level phonology with underlying forms and surface forms. For instance, the constraint dep schwa, whatever dep means, is an abbreviation for something that's quite ununderstandable, but dep schwa, that means a pronounced schwa must be underlyingly present. So the phrase quel hasard is outruled by this constraint because it contains a schwa that's not present in the underlying form. So you don't insert stuff that's not in your lexicon. That's never violated in French either, at least not in the simplification, today's simplification. Then the constraint max schwa, that's the reverse, so an underlying schwa must be pronounced as schwa. That's what it says. So une and os, this rules out unos because it doesn't pronounce the underlying schwa. But this constraint is very often violated in actual French phrases like une idée, l'homme, une femme. All of these things have underlying schwas and they're not pronounced. So that means, in OT terms, that this constraint is low ranked, is ranked below all the other constraints there. Now, a grammar in OT is the ranking of the constraints. Which constraints outranks which one? Constraints can interact with each other, right? They can be conflicting. Well, maybe this max glottal stop constraint outranks a constraint that says star glottal stop, meaning that we don't want to pronounce a glottal stop. This is because in the case of quel hasard, it's better to pronounce this underlying glottal stop, which is underlyingly present in hasard, than to delete it and to say quel hasard. Right, so this predicts this ranking. Because if this constraint were ranked high, then this form would be preferred over that form. We can also maybe assume that it's worse to pronounce a glottal stop than to pronounce a schwa, because une os is better than une os. It's also worse to pronounce a schwa than to not have its surface if it's underlying. We can see that because we have the word l'homme is better than le homme. L'homme violates this constraint and le homme violates that constraint. If this is better than this constraint, that it violates has to be ranked lower than the other one. Also in une femme is better than une femme. So apparently we want to delete the schwa, and we can propose a constraint like star schwa, don't pronounce a schwa. So this doesn't pronounce a schwa even if it's underlyingly present. That's what this means. Okay. That was fast, wasn't it? So the constraints that we have seen that were never violated, I propose that they are on top of the grammar. They outrank all the other constraints. And this is the ranking that we have seen, parts of. And the lowest rank constraint is max schwa. And there's also a constraint I didn't mention yet, which wants a liaison consonant to surface. So it's satisfied in les hommes and it's not satisfied in les garçons and les hasards. So this is the liaison consonant. So this is the whole grammar. And yes, this is my today's proposal for the correct ranking. But I will now show that 3 of the 12 forms are handled incorrectly under this ranking, at least under the speaker-based view of faithfulness. I say quite unfairly because the ranking can be patched up. I will show that later as well. So now I'll show you how this works. I've heard today that very few people actually know how OT works. So these French examples, which are now very, very, very familiar to you, will explain OT at the same moment. So this is a tableau. In the top left cell we have an underlying form, le plus garçon. And here we have 2 candidates. There may be more, but there's no space on the wall here. So le garçon is a candidate, le garçon is a candidate. Well, this candidate is ruled out by a very high rank constraint, namely this one. I put those 2 constraints in the same column because they're both high ranked and for reasons of space. Le garçon violates this constraint. And because it's the highest rank constraint, the one most to the left, this candidate is ruled out. That's the exclamation mark. And the candidate le garçon violates nothing. Until, well, it violates star schwa, right? Because it pronounces a schwa. And this candidate would also violate max schwa. That means pronounce an underlying schwa. So this is a violation mark here as well. Right, so if the grammar is like this, that means if the constraints are ranked in a fixed order like this, then le garçon will win. That is the winner is denoted by this pointing finger here. There's also a check mark here, means that that's actual French. Right? There's also, this grammar worked correctly for that form. Okay. So we go on. We have 12 tableaus like this. So you get used to it. The underlying le hasard. Well, something like this. Le hasard is ruled out because of the same constraint against funny initial sequences. Max glottal stop is ranked high. It means that an underlying glottal stop has to surface. So this rules out these candidates, le hasard and lazare. So this constraint rules out these 2 candidates, so the one that wins must be this one, le hasard. It violates the least high-ranked constraints. Not the fewest, but the least high-ranked constraints. So that form wins, and that's a pointing finger, but actual French is this. So we have the wrong winner. This can't be the grammar of French. It works for vowels. Le plus homme. This is, of course, completely out of the question. Le homme is outruled because you don't want the glottal stop. You don't want the schwa either. So you choose l'homme, and that violates only the very lowest ranked constraint, max schwa, the constraint that says as an underlying schwa should surface. The underlying schwa here doesn't surface, right? It's erased, it's deleted, but it violates only the lowest ranked constraint. So it's still the optimal candidate here, and is also the correct one in French. Now get enchainment. Quel garçon, well, the candidate quel garçon violates nothing. And saying things like quel garçon would introduce a non-underlying schwa, so that's ruled out. And any other funny candidate will also be ruled out. This is the quel hasard case. You don't want to insert a schwa, so quel hasard is ruled out. Now you have to choose between quel hasard and quel hasard. In quel hasard, so the enchaining case, you would violate the faithfulness constraint for underlying glottal stop to surface. Okay, so the first one wins. Which means that this ranking of 7 constraints handles the quel hasard case correctly. It also handles the quel-homme case correctly. Quel-homme violates nothing. Underlying quel-homme and the surface quel-homme, nothing changes, everything is there. No funny structural constraints violated. So no stars in this row at all, and that's the winner, and it's the correct one in French. We're halfway through. Now we have liaison, underlying liaison consonant. Well, remember it has this funny constraint here. There used to be Max Schwa here, but this one is ranked at the same height. It doesn't have to surface. And in fact, it doesn't surface. Les garçons is out because of this constraint. Les garçons would satisfy these constraints here because the Z is not followed by a consonant, but followed by an inserted vowel. But you can't insert a vowel that constraint is high ranked as well. So the thing that remains is saying les garçons. So this is handled correctly in this grammar. Gee. And here we have a mistake again. So les hasards, because of the high ranking of max glottal stop, the winning candidate will be the candidate with the glottal stop, les hasards, rather than what people usually say, les hasards, without the glottal stop. Of course, listener-oriented idea would be les hasards is good enough. It makes a difference between les hasards and les hasards. Les hommes and les hasards. And speaker-based liaison, for the vowel, you get les hommes, and les hommes violates nothing. That's the first candidate. And everything else either deletes something, or inserts something, or pronounces something that you don't want to pronounce. So that's the winning candidate. Now we have the schwa drop case. Une femme. Why does the schwa drop? Well, that's simply because star schwa is ranked a little bit higher than max schwa. So the fact that you don't want to have the schwa is just a little bit more important than the fact that you want to pronounce an underlying schwa. This is handled correctly. The une-os case must be handled incorrectly. As we saw before, the winning candidate is une-os, not une-os. Because une-os, as well as une-os, violate this max glottal stop constraint. And finally, une idée is une idée because it only violates faithfulness for the underlying schwa. Now, no ranking at all of these constraints would handle all those facts correctly. This ranking wouldn't do it, any other ranking would fare even worse. Although these are the constraints that you would propose on the basis of the data. Now, if you have a look at the things that went wrong here, the winning candidate was les hasards instead of les hasards, or this one. Le hasard instead of le hasard, and une hausse instead of une hausse. And all three cases is cases where the actual attested surface form has hiatus, which means in French 2 vowels in a row in different syllables. Le hasard, les hasards, une hausse. It's all the same. So, how can we fix this grammar? How can we patch up the hierarchy in such a way that it works for French? For instance, Maisbourg and Gabriel propose the following 3 constraints. They say, well, we have a constraint that doesn't want to pronounce a glottal stop in between 2 vowels. Well, that would indeed outlaw the winners le hasard and les hasards. But if you look at the tableaus, which you can do at home probably, if you look at the tableaus, you would see that if you put this constraint on top, then indeed these won't become the winners. But the actual forms without glottal stop wouldn't become the winners either. The winners would be l'hasard and les hasards in those tableaus. So those are the new winners if you put this new constraint on top. Well, what's the problem with l'hasard and les hasards? The syllable island. So hasard doesn't begin with a syllable boundary. Les hasards doesn't begin with a syllable boundary here. So you have a constraint like a line, the left side of an underlying glottal stop with the left side of a syllable. So the left side of the underlying glottal stop is supposedly here. On the surface it's gone, so and it's not aligned with the beginning of the syllable, so it's violated here and it's violated there. Well, that's how they patch it up. And that accounts for the forms le hasard and les hasards. But then they have to outlaw the third form, une hausse, with this very funny constraint that says you have to pronounce a schwa if it's underlyingly present, especially before a glottal stop, an underlying glottal stop. Well, you know, there are always ways to patch up your hierarchy in OT, and for non-OTists, that's the bad thing about OT, because you know many authors do that. They propose constraints to fill up the holes in the reasoning. And this case is like that, because, well, you know, okay, you don't have a glottal stop between 2 vowels. Maybe that's reasonable. A line, a glottal stop with a syllable, maybe that's reasonable as well. But how about this constraint? Schwa should surface, especially if a glottal stop follows. Why is that? What does it express? We don't see it in any other language. Constraints are supposed to be, you know, a bit universal, so it's not cross-linguistically validated. And its sole purpose seems to be to preserve some underlying material, schwa, if some other underlying material, that's the glottal stop, doesn't surface, because you say une hausse. This constraint has to work on underlying glottal stops. The glottal stop is not present in the output. So it has a sole purpose, and it doesn't look as if it has that purpose. So I think it's wrong. And the problem is in the faithfulness constraints. The faithfulness constraints are speaker-based. So max, glottal stop means pronounce an underlying glottal stop as a glottal stop. A listener-oriented version of this constraint would be pronounce an underlying glottal stop as something that the listener will perceive as a glottal stop. Now that's very different. Because how can you tell if something is a glottal stop? But maybe you can tell whether a listener will hear it as a glottal stop, will perceive a glottal stop. Perception is a language-specific thing, you know. So maybe the French will perceive a glottal stop in certain situations that others wouldn't. So, a simple proposal. The French listener will perceive an overt sequence of 2 vowels, like ea, as containing glottal stop. So even if it's not auditorily present or actually articulated, it's what the perceiver creates. You can do that, right? As a listener. This proposal is comparable to proposing that constraint by Meisenberg and Gabriel, comparable in the sense that it's of comparable simplicity, or complexity rather. So what does it mean? Well, it means that le hasard is perceived as if it contained a glottal stop. It's perceived as le hasard, right? A hidden abstract structure. Le hasard is perceived as if it contains a glottal stop. Une hausse is perceived as if it contained a glottal stop. Le homme, if you could say that, would be perceived as le homme, as if it contained a glottal stop. So these are not French, so that's why I say would be perceived. Les hommes would be perceived as this, with a glottal stop. Une idée, if you say une idée, the perceiver will hear a glottal stop between the schwa and the I. Now if you combine this with the listener-oriented faithfulness proposal, we have to conclude that le hasard, les hasards and une hausse satisfy max glottal stop. The underlying glottal stop is actually perceived in these words because vowel sequences are perceived as if they have a glottal stop in the middle. So these forms do not violate max glottal stop if faithfulness constraints are listener-oriented and the French perceive a glottal stop between every two vowels. Les hommes, le homme, and une idée would violate if they ever occurred that glottal stop. They would insert a glottal stop in perception. Now I'll now show that all 12 forms are handled correctly in this view. If dep glottal stop is ignored for the moment, then 8 tableaus will stay the same and 4 tableaus with the underlying glottal stop will change, and those tableaus are included here as well as on the handout. So le hasard, underlying le hasard, the same 4 candidates, same 4 pronunciation candidates in this case. Well, le hasard, which is the correct form in French, used to violate max glottal stop, right? The underlying glottal stop doesn't surface. But the French will perceive a glottal stop there anyway. So it doesn't violate max glottal stop. So I erased the asterisk here. And by erasing the asterisk here, this becomes the winner. And it is the correct form. Nothing changes much in this tableau, which already was correct, except that we have erased something here, which is immaterial. Well, les hasards the same. This form used to violate max glottal stop, making this the optimal form. Now it doesn't in a listener-oriented view, so this becomes the winner, and the correct winner. And now for une hausse. There used to be an asterisk here in the speaker-based view, so that this was the winner. But now une hausse doesn't violate max glottal stop anymore because it has this hiatus, in which the French perceive a glottal stop. So it becomes the optimal form under the same ranking. Now all 12 forms are handled correctly. Does anyone feel that he's been cheated here? I don't know. And we compare the two accounts again. Speaker-based account requires a constraint like don't have a glottal stop between two vowels, align the left part of an underlying glottal stop with a syllable on the surface. This unspeakable constraint. And the listener-oriented account requires to assume that hiatus is perceived as a glottal stop. And if this sounds too weird, then you may want to say, well, it is not actually an underlying glottal stop, an underlying syllable boundary. So a syllable boundary is perceived in hiatus all of the time. And then, so hiatus is perceived with a syllable boundary, but then also the glottal stop and the creak will have to be perceived as a syllable boundary. That would be the alternative view. perhaps somewhat easier to swallow. But it would also be a listener-oriented view, because the syllable boundary has several different auditory correlates, namely the creak, the glottal stop, the pause, or the hiatus, the fact that you have two vowels at all. There are a couple of empirical differences between these two proposals, and they go both ways. But that's too much detail here. Yeah, to sum up, but I have a couple of more slides coming after this, and not on the handout. Listener-oriented faithfulness succeeds where speaker-based faithfulness fails, unless you patch it up with very weird constraints. You require 3-level phonology, that's Tesar-Smolensky 98 or Boersma 98, which distinguishes overt auditory forms. Well, I combine the term overt form by Tesar-Smolensky with the term auditory form by Boersma. And you have abstract phonological surface structures, which have more glottal stops in French. Now, several discussions today were about variation. And I have added a couple of slides about that subject. Yeah. Oh, there's lots of time left, only 50 minutes left. If you really think about the ranking I just presented, and the idea of why une hausse was the best form, then I said that une hausse has this schwa-o sequence, in which it's easier to perceive the syllable boundary than in une hausse, right? So une hausse was labeled okayish, and une hausse as good. But the preference of une hausse over une hausse was actually attributed in this ranking by the ranking of star glottal stop above star schwa. So pronouncing a glottal stop is worse than pronouncing a schwa. That's not so listener-oriented. It can be made even more listener-oriented, not just with listener-oriented faithfulness constraints, but the difference between these can be turned into relative listener-orientedness as well. And indeed, that's possible. We can do away with the constraint, almost do away with the constraint, star glottal stop. In 11 of the 12 tableaus, the effects can be handled with depth glottal stop. Don't pronounce a glottal stop if it's underlyingly not present. If you want to check that, go ahead later. The remaining tableau is une hausse again. So, well, a special kind of listener-oriented constraints are probabilistic faithfulness constraints. They say, for instance, max glottal stop X%. It reads like this: pronounce an underlying glottal stop as something that has X% probability of being perceived as a glottal stop. Yeah, and of course this schwa has a larger probability, this hiatus has a larger probability of being perceived as a glottal stop than this actual bit of creak there has. So how does that work in OT? Even more listener-oriented account. Well, the form une hausse, it used to violate max glottal stop, right? An underlying glottal stop is not heard. Well, it's not even heard in 20% of the cases, right? But in une hausse, well, it is heard in more than 20% of the cases, but it may not be heard in 90% of the cases if you pronounce only this slight glottal stop with a bit of creak or whatever it is. Une hausse. I don't know. What percentage of the cases will the listener perceive a glottal stop? Well, maybe not 90. So this is the constraint that is violated in une hausse. But une hausse has a hiatus in which maybe more than 90% of the cases the listener can reconstruct the syllable boundary. So that form doesn't violate that faithfulness constraint. So we can do without, almost do without, star glottal stop. It can be at the bottom ranked. But I wanted you to swallow listener-oriented faithfulness constraints. This goes one step further, so it probably confuses you. Well, how about this perception? If you feel cheated about my proposal that hiatus is perceived as a glottal stop, well, you have to realize that perception is language dependent, and so we do it in OT. And then we have the structural constraints in OT that works in perception. It says star hiatus, perceive no hiatus. And there's a constraint against perceiving nothing as a full consonant, or a constraint as perceiving nothing that's silence or really nothing, no duration. Silence has duration, right? There's really nothing. Perceive nothing as a glottal stop. Well, it's worse to perceive nothing as a full consonant than to perceive nothing as a glottal stop, right? We can believe that. So, this is how you can do perception in OT. This is not the underlying form now. This is the auditory form, or the overt form. So what we do here is perception or robust interpretive parsing. The candidates are surface structures, full surface structures, phonological thingies, and this is a pronunciation, an auditory form. So une os comes in, and you perceive it as une os. This is what the French do. Why? Well, because it's a high-ranked structural constraint for French. You simply don't have these structures in French at all on the surface. That constraint would be violated if you perceived une os as une os. And then you could, of course, perceive it as une os or une tos. Well, if you perceive this thing as une tos, that would be very weird. That would be perceiving nothing as a full consonant, as perceiving nothing as a T. So people smile, right? Everyone can feel that would be really funny, even for the French, right? Yeah, which you know, like, who can really delete underlying T's, so you can do it the other way around. Okay, so the remaining candidate is this one. This is just half of a consonant, right? And you will perceive this hiatus as that. So you can do perception in OT, yeah. And these real constraints that also could work in production, work in perception as well, as Spolensky has shown for metrical phonology. Well, the allomorphy case, if someone asks for that. Now the variation case. This is interesting. Several people have asked about this today. Well, this Meisenburg and Gabriel is not just an OT account of what happens in French, right? This Tranel and all the other people, those were OT accounts about a sort of idealized French. They did real French. They made measurements. They did acoustic measurements, what people were actually saying. So, I say there's variation for this une os. People say une os or une os. Sometimes occurs in a minority of cases. Une os, so the schwa plus creak, everything at the same time. There's also variation in le hasard and le hasard, so you can have the creak there as well. They actually had different examples like tout hongrois, but I guess the same works for le hasard. Yeah, so the variation has to be accounted for. Well, the variation in une os. How can we have these three forms the winner? All three forms occur in the language, right? So they all have check marks. They're all okay, okay French. And we want to have a grammar in which all of those three are the winners as well, right? In order to be able to do French. Well, let's see how these constraints are. This constraint says pronounce an underlying glottal stop at something that will be perceived as a glottal stop 95% of the time. And you can only get that if you pronounce both the schwa and the glottal stop. If you say une os, then no one will think that you were actually saying une os, right? So this is even better perceptually than saying une os, right? Une os, it has all the cues there. This has a small part of the cues, this has even more cues, and this has all the cues. So that candidate is best with respect to this constraint here. This candidate, une os, is best with respect to that constraint, don't pronounce glottal stop. This candidate is best with respect to the constraint, don't pronounce a schwa. Now, imagine that these constraints are ranked at the same height. They're ranked at the same height. Now you do stochastic OT. Yeah, in which case if constraints are ranked at the same height, then two constraints are ranked at the same height, half of the time one wins and half the time the other wins. If three constraints are ranked at the same height, well, either has all of the 6 possible rankings have an equal chance of occurring. Now, if this constraint is on top during evaluation, then this form will win. If this constraint is on top during evaluation, then this form will win here. And if this constraint is on top during evaluation, the second form will win. Right? So by ranking these constraints at the same height, these forms become equally harmonic, so to say, they are all optimal. It's one of the ways of doing variation. There's a bit more variation. People claim that for the word hasard, you could either say, this is how Tonel says it, but he means the following. You can say quel hasard, but quel hasard is actually possible. So if there are any real French people here and wanted to ask that, hey, but I can say that. Yes, that's true. Tonel says that it couldn't be done for héros. So quel héros would be impossible, but Meisenburg and Gabriel actually found that all the time. So yeah, there's variation there as well. So, I've showed you 3 probabilistic listener-oriented faithfulness constraints, right? Pronounce an underlying glottal stop as something that will be perceived as a glottal stop 20% of the time, 90% of the time, 95% of the time. It's of course more important that the listener perceives it as a glottal stop 20% of the time than 95%, right? So there's sort of a fixed ranking there. If you rank the constraints in this way, those are the constraints that we have seen before, right? Nothing new. And they're ranked along a continuous scale. And there is some noise during evaluation, that's stochastic OT. So the constraint that's ranked just below another constraint can sometimes win, right? Say 40% of the time. Then you find, this is what I did this morning when I woke up at 5:30. You will find quel hasard 85% of the time, quel hasard 14%. You will find the triple variation in une os, and une os. And you find une os in only 0.8% of the time, so that's why people say it can't occur. You find some variation between les hasards and les hasards, between le hasard and le hasard, and you even find l'hasard 2% of the time. Except for this form, everything you find here is, well, there's only 2%. Everything you find here is attested and reported violation. And the way you get it is only by ranking the constraints at not too large distances from each other. Yeah, that's it. That's the variation bit as well. Thanks.
So you showed that there is a 3-way distinction in the facts, right? There's consonants behave one way, vowels behave a different way, and this other thing, whatever it is, It's yet another way. Then you show that traditional solutions, which at first only have a two-member ontology, either vowels or consonants, cannot work. Well, it's interesting. It's not that surprising. If you only have a two-member ontology, you only get a two-way distinction. You can't get a three-way distinction. In your solution, you have a three-way distinction because you have vowels, you have consonants, and then you have this other provision that tells you don't merge this particular thing with vowels. It doesn't say don't merge any consonant with vowels. It says don't merge this particular thing with vowels. So you have a three-member ontology in your system. That's why you solve the problem. I'm not sure you gave the same breaks to the competition. Did you show that if you have if you allow a third member of the ontology in a traditional type solution, you cannot get, in a traditional type approach, you cannot get. So, for example, what came to my mind is, isn't it true that all of these modifiers show up in their precausal form before this thing?
The modifiers, you mean?
Yeah,
What?
like the lay and the articles.
Okay, yeah.
And so,
They occur in preposal.
yeah, don't they show up in their precausal form when they occur before the aspiré?
It is.
What, I don't know what's the preposal form of le or une.
Interrogatives, mange le.
Okay, that one, yeah.
So just call it an
Right,
underlying-
yeah.
So just call it an underlying pause. It seems to me it would work without.
J'en veux une, j'en veux une.
It is the underlying.
I mean, how would that Yeah, okay,
Intuition.
let's say that that's true. What would that mean?
So if you just said that without having the listener-oriented theory, if you just said this is an underlying cause, and you have faithfulness to that, which is ranked high enough, then that will give you the. Will that work? That would work.
Yeah, an underlying pause, yeah. An underlying glottal stop, underlying syllable boundary, an underlying pause. Yeah. That would work.
So you still.
So, yeah, but having a schwa would be an auditory cue for the underlying pause. So if you say une hausse or le hasard, even if there is no pause, you would perceive the pause, right? Because there's hiatus. So there would be, the French listener would have to perceive a pause in hiatus, right?
But
So it
you're
would,
saying that even on that interpretation, you still need to make reference to the listener.
yeah, because a pause, if a pause means a silence, then the silence is not the most usual cue for this. It varies. Sometimes you have creak. What does creak have to do with a pause, right? So perceive creak as a pause. Okay, that would. But so that would be. I mean, once you think in a listener-oriented way, then you say, okay, yeah, that's a cue for the pause. So, but. So either a pause or a syllable boundary or a glottal stop, and I think there will be very few, if any, empirical differences between them. Having a syllable boundary underlyingly instead of a glottal stop would have the advantage that the neutralization phrase initially is accounted for, because phrase initially you get a syllable boundary automatically, right, for free. So that even the and id cases, would have an initial syllable boundary, so fall together automatically with the aspiré. That would be the advantage of having a syllable boundary rather than a glottal stop underlyingly. What was the advantage of the reverse? The reverse advantage? I have to think about it. I can tell you later.
I'm just wondering, I don't understand this idea of perception. Does that mean that anytime there is a hiatus, whether there is an aspiré or not, people will will perceive it as a glottal stop, and this is confirmed by some psychological experiments?
Well, but the glottal.
I don't perceive it as
can't sit.
glottal stop at all. But
No, of course. Well,
of course I'm not French, so
no, but
so I'm not,
yeah,
you know,
right.
so
Well,
I'm deaf to-
whatever it is, the glottal stop is an arbitrary symbol that stands for whatever is there, right? So whether it's a glottal stop or a syllable boundary or a pause, but the thing has many allophones, right? Sometimes it is a glottal stop, sometimes it is a pause, sometimes it is creak, sometimes it's just hiatus. So the thing occurs in at least 4 forms, right? In quel hasard, it actually occurs as a glottal stop. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing which simply has at least 4 auditory cues for it. If any of these cues is available, then you have some percentage probability of perceiving that arbitrary symbol, which we could represent as a glottal stop or in any other way. And so it would mean, for instance, yeah, indeed, that words like PI or ABI underlyingly have this, either the syllable boundary or the glottal stop, depending on your theory of phonology. I don't think it matters much how you represent it underlyingly. Some arbitrary symbol, I chose this one, but it could be a boundary symbol. Yeah, Jason.
So I have a couple of questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe the most important one is this. If I understand how you'd set the theory up formally, you mentioned it was a 3-layer theory, 3-level theory, like sympathy theory, for example. So let me see if I can outline exactly what it would look like. You've got A, which is the underlying form, B, which is the surface form, and C, which is the perceived form.
Well, the word surface form is ambiguous here. So I would say the overt form and the the surface structure, you call it structure, the hidden thing, yeah. Full structural description.
Structure. I mean, what I have in mind
Yeah,
is that the intermediate form is the one that gets past to articulation.
Which is the intermediate one?
It's what gets sent to spell out. Yeah, that's the intermediate one. Right. So you have this system, if I understand it, where you're going to have most of your constraints are going to go from A to B, which is what we usually think of as production, and B to C, which is the first stage of perception or something. But you also have a faithfulness constraint between A and C, which is between level A and level
between
C.
the underlying form and
And the perceived form, the reconstructed form, which
yes, that's where faithfulness is.
Yes.
It compares surface structures with underlying forms, as in production.
Right, but you're comparing A with C, so this is the listener-oriented faithfulness. Ordinary faithfulness compares A with B. The underlying
Well, in a 2-level, it compares the 2 levels that are there. But in a 3-level model, you compare faithfulness. Well, okay. Okay. Well, you know, the underlying form is something abstract, right? So you could, lexical minimality is possible. I'll argue for that tomorrow. Lexical minimality is possible, and it doesn't interfere with richness of the base, right? That's tomorrow's talk. Okay, lexical representations are sort of economical and minimal, and these perceived surface representations are that as well. They contain the prosodic hierarchies, they contain foot structures, syllable structures, segments, features. Right. And these 2 structures, this surface structure and the underlying structure, are in the same alphabet. Right? They're comparable, they're commensurable. So faithfulness constraints can compare them. And the 3rd form is your vert form, simply the auditory stuff that you hear as a listener, or have to produce as a speaker, the articulation.
Right, well, so maybe I need to introduce a 4th form, because you haven't mentioned it yet. It's the one that the listener supposedly recovers, which you modeled at some point on the slides where you said you can also model perception with optimality theory.
Yeah, right, okay. Okay, I'll show you. I'll show you that in slide 1 here. No, that's okay. Okay, slide 1. Yeah, so there's a surface structure here and a surface structure there. So what the listener does, hearing 2 vowels, for instance, is at this level insert either the syllable boundary or the glottal stop or whatever it is presented as, and then accessing something in a lexicon, perhaps the word azar with an underlying glottal stop or syllable boundary, right? What the speaker does is choosing a, from the candidate set, choosing a pronunciation, computing for every pronunciation what the listener, what she thinks the listener will reconstruct from it. So these are both surface forms.
Okay,
this is the one in perception, this one in perception, this is the one in production. Faithfulness in production compares this with this.
Good. Okay, so with this diagram, I can now ask sort of a, I think I can ask this question very simply, which is what ensures that, that these two diagrams will agree on their answer. The way I was going to ask the question was this.
Very, very good. If they don't agree,
Yeah.
learning can take place.
Yeah, okay.
Simply. So, if what you perceive here, and then you access the lexicon and you compute what you would have produced, right? So you perceive something and there's some virtual production going on, and if this thing turns out to be different from that, you can re-rank. You can use EDCD or GLA or whatever to re-rank your constraints because there's a mismatch. This is the supposedly correct form in your tableau. This is the form that won in your tableau. Right? We have seen several tableaus with a pointing finger to the form that wins in the current grammar, and a correct form. If someone tells it to you that that's the correct form, that should have been the correct form, then you can re-rank constraints. So the learning algorithm for that.
There's some ambiguity in the signal, right? So
Yeah.
It might be the fact that it might be the case that the listener can't uniquely recover the form.
Right. So then it means that some constraints, if there's variation, some constraints keep going up as well as down on the next time. So if two constraints are ranked like this, not too far apart, and they really conflict, then they will hover like this. Hover, I don't know, like this, right? And the equilibrium will be the probability matching case, right? So you will, if a speaker produces something, say, produces this glottal stop in uno-os 1/3 of the time, you will also be trained as a listener to perceive, also to produce it 1/3 of the time, because you hear it 1/3 of the time. Well, yeah. So,
I think Paul will have to ask a question. Well, I don't think it's a particularly good last question, but I'll ask it anyway. So, did you talk about the relation, the formal computation of the SF from the OF? That is to say, it's sort of a variation on Fred's question, I think, which is, how are we to understand the claim that a particular acoustic stimulus causes a French perceiver to perceive an element that your theory requires to be perceived? Where in your formal analysis does that happen? And
the learning of it, you mean, the acquisition of it?
not really. I mean,
Oh, okay. Simply.
where are the constraints that take spectra
Okay.
into symbols?
Here they are. I think this was the slide. Yeah, okay. This is a perception tableau. OF to SF mapping. This is what the speaker knows that the listener will do. This is also what the listener does. Right? So an overt form uno-os is mapped to a surface structure which contains, this boundary symbol here.
So,
Yeah, and of course you have to learn that ranking as well.
so
And you haven't actually shown the full ranking here, right? Because from what you just said about learnability, you really are supposed to get back. No, I'm sorry, I take that.
Yeah, well, okay, a bit more detailed. These would be F1 values, F2 values, durations, pitches, all the auditory detail there, all the phonetic detail.
Have to say, perceive an F2 of so much, as a low vowel or something.
Yeah.
That's what they
Actually, don't perceive an F2 of so much as a low vowel. Don't perceive an F1 of so much as a constraints like that. Yeah, they have to be negatively formulated. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Yeah, yeah, but that's the case. Yeah, that's the case. Yeah. So these are also negatively formulated. It has to be negatively formulated. Otherwise, you can't do linear separation in two-dimensional space.
But what you have here suggests that the constraints are really symbolic, but in fact, they're constraints relating the symbolic
Yeah.
SF to the non-symbolic
Yes.
OF.
That's what they do.
I
So
think
it's-
the only non-symbolic part of those constraints is epsilon. So it's, right?
Epsilon? Where's
Well,
that?
it's the square brackets that have nothing in them.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing referring to the non-symbolic.
Yeah, let's start easy, right? So the nothingness here.
Right.
That's the only order. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing is something that
Is-
both formalisms do pretty well.
Yeah, well, if you want to see how F1 and F2 values are mapped, then go to my website to take the paper on top, and it does with constraints that indeed say an F1 of 300 hertz is not U or something. All those constraints for all F1 values, all F2 values, and all vowels, and we do the Dutch vowel system consisting of 8 vowels, and it nicely linearly separates the two-dimensional space. Yeah. So, yes, there have been explicit proposals for that. Yeah. Okay. Just saying about this. Tomorrow, I will give a talk tomorrow, and it will specifically address the formalization of perception, with much more interesting cases than this one.
It'll be in cognitive science, 134 at 9:30
AM.
a.m.
Yeah.
We're crazy.